Picture this: a crowded square under the golden light of torches, the air thick with music and laughter, thousands of people dancing in celebration. It's a festival, a moment of collective joy, a temporary escape from the hardships of daily life. But what if I told you that scenes like this, meant to unite and uplift, have secretly been the spark that ignited revolutions? That the very gatherings designed to strengthen rulers have, time and again, become the stages where empires crumble. History is filled with moments where the line between celebration and chaos blurs, where the energy of a festival twists into something far more dangerous, toppling kings, shattering regimes, and rewriting the fate of nations. Take Rome's Saturnalia, for example, a week of feasting, role reversals, and wild revelry where slaves dined with their masters, and social norms were turned upside down. On the surface, it was a pressure valve, a way to keep the people content, but beneath the laughter, it was a reminder of how fragile power really is. Because when you give people a taste of freedom, even in jest, they might just decide they want more. Or consider Egypt's Opet festival, where the pharaohs paraded through the streets, basking in the adoration of their subjects until the day that adoration turned to fury, and the crowd's cheers became demands for change. These weren't just parties gone wrong. They were moments when the masks of authority slipped, when the people realized their collective power, and when empires learned the hard way that no throne is unshakable. So why does this matter to us today? Because the dance between power and the people never really ends. Festivals might look different now, no chariot races or temple processions, but the underlying tensions, those haven't changed. Whether it's a protest that erupts during a national holiday or a political speech drowned out by chance, the same forces are at work. And that's what we're exploring in this video. 26 times ancient festivals escalated into revolutions and regime collapse. From the riot that brought down a pharaoh to the carnival that sparked a rebellion, we'll uncover how joy can turn to fury, how celebration can become defiance, and how the crowd, once assembled, can become unstoppable. This isn't just history, it's a lesson in what happens when those in power forget who truly holds the reins. So settle in, because we're about to journey through some of the most explosive moments the ancient world ever witnessed, and you might just see the present in a whole new light by the end. The Saturnalia festival was supposed to be Rome's great equalizer. For a few days each December, the social order flipped upside down. Masters served meals to their slaves, citizens dressed as beggars, and the streets roared with laughter and wine. But in the year 217, that laughter curdled into something far more dangerous. You see, the elites had always assumed the festival's chaos was safe, a controlled release valve for the frustrations of the lower classes. What they didn't anticipate was how easily role-playing could turn into role-rejecting. As the festival reached its peak, enslaved workers and impoverished plebeians began whispering in the shadows of the feast halls. The temporary freedom to speak openly, to mock their masters without punishment, had given them a taste of something intoxicating, not just the wine, but the idea that things didn't have to stay the way they were. By the third night, the jokes had hardened into demands. A group of enslaved dockworkers, emboldened by the festival's anarchic spirit, refused to return to their labor when the celebrations ended. Their defiance spread like wildfire through the city's slums and workshops. Soon, crowds flooded the forum, not with garlands and songs, but with chants for fair wages and an end to debt slavery. The Senate panicked. They'd expected Saturnalia to reinforce the hierarchy, not undermine it. Soldiers were called in to restore order, but the crackdown only fueled the flames. The very tools meant to keep the peace, the batons, the shields, the threats of punishment, now became symbols of the oppression the festival had temporarily erased. And here's the cruel irony: the uprising was eventually crushed, but the elites learned the wrong lesson. Instead of addressing the injustices that had sparked the riots, they doubled down on control. Saturnalia's traditions were tightened, its subversive edges dulled, yet the memory of that rebellion lingered like a ghost in the banquet halls. This wasn't just a riot, it was a revelation. The ruling class had assumed their power was as solid as the marble beneath their feet, but Saturnalia proved that power was just a story, and stories could be rewritten. The festival's temporary chaos had shown the oppressed how fragile their chains really were, and though this particular revolt failed, the idea it planted that the social order wasn't destiny would echo through Rome's history, resurfacing in slave revolts and plebeian protests for centuries to come. The elites had hoped Saturnalia would remind everyone of their place. Instead, it taught them how to resist it. The wine flowed freely in Thebes that spring, the city drunk on more than just the spirit of Dionysus. Every year, the festival honoring the god of ecstasy and liberation swept through Greece like a fever. Drumbeats pulsed through the streets, masked revelers danced in frenzied circles, and for a few delirious nights, the rigid lines between slave and citizen, man and woman, even human and divine, seemed to dissolve. But in the year 405 before the Common Era, the usual chaos took a dangerous turn. The ruling tyrants of Thebes had always tolerated the Dionysian rites, believing them harmless, a way to let off steam. What they failed to grasp was that the festival's madness wasn't just about abandon. It was about transformation. In the throes of ritual, worshippers didn't just imitate Dionysus. They became him, channeling his defiance of boundaries and order. And on the third night of the festival, as the fires burned high and the air rang with chanting, something shifted. A group of dissidents, their faces hidden behind grotesque wooden masks, began weaving a new refrain into the songs, a call to arms disguised as hymn. By dawn, the streets were no longer filled with dancers but with rebels. The masks that had once concealed their identities now united them as a single, unstoppable force. The tyrants, accustomed to recognizing their enemies by face and status, found themselves paralyzed. How do you crush a revolt when you can't tell the difference between a baker and a nobleman in the swirling crowd? The festival's sacred chaos, meant to honor a god, had become the perfect cover for revolution. The violence that followed was swift and brutal. The palaestra where the tyrants had once trained their soldiers became a battleground, the marble floors slick with more than ceremonial wine. By the time the sun set, the old regime was finished. But here's the twist: the rebels didn't discard the masks when the fighting ended. They kept them, hanging the hollow faces in the newly democratic assembly as a reminder. Power wasn't just taken that day, it was remade. The Dionysian revolt proved that rituals could do more than reinforce tradition. They could erase it. What makes this moment so chilling isn't just the bloodshed. It's the revelation that the tools of control festivals designed to pacify could be turned against those in power with terrifying ease. Thebes' rulers had assumed the frenzy of Dionysus would exhaust the people's rebellious energy. Instead, it amplified it, and that's the paradox of these ancient festivals. The very thing that made them useful to elites, their ability to temporarily suspend reality, also made them explosive. Because once people taste what it feels like to live without chains, even for a night, they might just decide to break them forever. Noras was supposed to be about rebirth, fresh starts, new beginnings, the earth waking from winter's grip. For centuries, the Persian New Year festival had been a time of unity, with families gathering around half-sin tables adorned with sprouts and sweets. exchanging gifts and leaping over bonfires to leave the past behind. But in the year 488, the flames of those bonfires burned brighter than anyone expected, not with renewal, but with rage. The governor of Fars province had grown fat on the people's labor, his taxes crushing farmers and merchants alike. When he announced a new decree that Noras celebrations would be taxed, that even the traditional sprouts on every table required a fee, something in the air shifted. The festival's rituals, meant to symbolize hope, suddenly took on a sharper meaning. Those sprouting seeds, they weren't just emblems of spring. They became metaphors for resistance, for the stubborn persistence of life even under the weight of oppression. And when the governor's soldiers tore down the first half-sin display in the city square, the crowd didn't scatter. They surged forward. What happened next wasn't just a riot, it was a reimagining. The rebels didn't discard Noras traditions, they weaponized them. Bonfires meant to purify became barriers against cavalry charges. The poetry readings, a staple of the festival, turned into underground meetings where coded verses called for uprising. Even the act of jumping over flames, a ritual meant to cleanse the soul, was recast as a dare against authority, each leap a silent vow to overthrow the governor. The brilliance of this revolt lay in its symbolism. By framing their rebellion within the festival's existing rituals, the people made their cause inseparable from tradition itself. When the governor screamed that they were defiling Noras, the rebels had the perfect retort: "No, you did." The festival's sacred language of renewal now justified revolution. Within weeks, the governor's palace was in ashes, his tax rolls burned alongside the ceremonial fires. This wasn't just a victory over a corrupt official. It was a masterclass in how to hijack symbolism. The elites had assumed festivals were tools to reinforce their power, a way to remind the people of their place in the cosmic order. But the Noras rebellion proved that those same rituals could be flipped, that the stories a culture tells itself about renewal and justice could be turned against the very rulers who sponsored them. Long after the governor's downfall, the half-sin tables still bore sprouts, but now they also carried the unspoken memory of how a celebration of life became a fight for it. The Nile glittered under the midday sun as the golden bark of Ammon floated toward Luxor temple, its decks heavy with offerings, precious metals, sacks of grain, jeweled statues. Crowds lined the riverbanks, their voices rising in hymns for the Opet festival, the most sacred event in Thebes' calendar. For 20 days each year, Pharaoh played his divine role perfectly, leading the procession as the living link between gods and men. But in the 12th year of his reign, something ruptured. The people's hymns faltered, their bowed heads lifted, because this time they couldn't ignore the truth. The barges groaned with wealth while their children went hungry. The festival had always been a spectacle of power, a way to reinforce Pharaoh's godlike status, but excess has a way of backfiring. When the priests began distributing ceremonial bread to the crowd, moldy loaves, half the usual portion, a murmur spread through the procession. The temple granaries were overflowing, everyone knew it, so why were the people's rations shrinking? Then came the final insult, Pharaoh's new decree that every family must donate an extra measure of grain to ensure the gods' favor. The demand wasn't just greedy, it was reckless, because the Opet festival wasn't merely a religious event, it was the one time when Pharaoh's divinity was performative, his power dependent on the crowd's belief. And belief, once fractured, is hard to repair. What happened next wasn't an organized revolt. It was something far more dangerous: collective disbelief. As Pharaoh passed, a single voice from the crowd shouted what others had only whispered: "You eat while we starve." The priests tried to drown it out with chanting, but the damage was done. The sacred spell of the procession broke. people began tossing their offerings into the Nile, not flowers or coins, but clods of dirt, broken pottery, anything to mock the pretense of devotion. The festival's most subversive act, when the crowd redirected their prayers not to Ammon or Pharaoh, but to the river itself, the real source of life. The aftermath unfolded slowly but fatally. Without the aura of divine legitimacy, Pharaoh's tax collectors met resistance in every village. The priesthood, sensing the wind shifting, began quietly redistributing temple stores to the people. And within 2 years, the dynasty collapsed not to foreign invaders or rival nobles, but to the quiet erosion of faith, because the Opet mutiny revealed an ancient truth: rulers who mistake ritual for reality risk everything. Pharaoh thought the festival was about reinforcing his power. The people proved it was about something far more fragile: their consent. Here's what makes this moment so haunting. Unlike open rebellion, this was a revolution of the mind. The Opet festival's real power wasn't in its gold or grandeur. It was in the unspoken contract it represented. The people would play their part so long as Pharaoh played his. The moment he broke that contract, the moment the performance of divinity became indistinguishable from greed, the entire illusion crumbled. And that's the danger of sacred festivals in the hands of corrupt rulers. They don't just risk angering the people, they risk awakening them to the truth that gods can be unmade and so can kings. The streets of Loyang shimmered under the glow of 10,000 lanterns, their delicate paper shells painted with scenes of prosperity, fat carp leaping toward the moon, plum blossoms bursting into bloom. It was the 15th day of the new year, the Lantern Festival, and for one night the rigid hierarchies of Han China softened. Peasants mingled with scholars in the lantern-lit alleys, children darted between legs clutching sweets, and lovers exchanged verses under the cover of swaying lights. The emperor had always seen the festival as harmless, a way to let the people blow off steam before returning to their plows and ledgers. But in the year 184, those same glowing lanterns became signals for something far darker than poetry. For months, the Yellow Turban rebels had been organizing in the countryside, their grievances piling up like unpaid tax scrolls, corrupt officials, failing crops, a court too distant to care. The Lantern Festival's chaos provided the perfect camouflage. In the jostling crowds, messages could be passed without suspicion. A red lantern hung slightly askew might mark a safe house. A coded riddle whispered between friends could set a rebellion in motion. And when the emperor's spies finally caught wind of the whispers, his reaction sealed his fate. Instead of addressing the rebels' complaints, he banned the festival outright, calling it a breeding ground for sedition. The ban didn't extinguish the rebellion. It poured oil on it, because the Lantern Festival wasn't just a party, it was a lifeline. For people grinding through another year of hardship, those few hours of light and laughter were sacred. Taking them away didn't crush dissent. It proved the emperor saw his subjects as threats, not citizens. Overnight, the Yellow Turban's ranks swelled with furious new recruits. Farmers who'd never held a sword now tied yellow cloth around their heads, their anger burning brighter than any forbidden lantern. When the uprising finally erupted, it did so with the festival's own symbolism twisted into a weapon. Rebels marched under lanterns painted with slogans instead of poems. The floating lights that once carried wishes to the heavens now illuminated the paths of advancing armies. And in a final irony, the emperor's own palace guardmen, who'd grown up cherishing the festival, hesitated when ordered to cut down crowds singing the same lantern-lighting songs they'd known since childhood. This revolt wasn't just about taxes or corruption. It was about who gets to control joy. The Han dynasty had assumed festivals were privileges they could revoke at will. The Yellow Turbans proved they were right, and that trying to snuff them out only makes the flames spread faster. long after the rebellion was crushed, the lesson lingered. The next emperor reinstated the Lantern Festival, but the people never forgot. Those delicate paper lights held a power no decree could match, the power to reveal how thin the line is between celebration and revolution, and how quickly light can become fire. The golden disk of Intai, the sun god, hung low over Cusco as the city prepared for its most sacred ritual, Intai Ramey. For 9 days, the streets would pulse with music, the air thick with the scent of roasting llama meat and chicha corn beer. The Sapa Inca, draped in robes spun from sunlight itself, would lead the ceremonies, his every gesture designed to remind the people of his divine bond with Intai. But in the year 1532, the sun seemed to turn its face away, crops withered in the fields, the terraces stood barren, and when the emperor stepped forward to perform the ritual that would renew the sun's strength, the crowd didn't bow. They glared. Here's what the rulers misunderstood. Intai Ramey wasn't just a display of power, it was a contract. The people would offer their labor, their faith, their silence so long as the Sapa Inca and his priests held up their end of the bargain, ensuring the sun returned, the rains fell, the earth gave life. But now, with starvation gnawing at their bellies, the ritual felt like a grotesque pantomime. The emperor's golden mask couldn't hide the truth. The gods weren't listening. Or worse, they'd abandoned their chosen ruler. The breaking point came on the 5th day during the sacrifice of the flawless white llama. As the high priest raised his knife, a woman's voice sliced through the silence. Why spill blood for nothing? The priest hesitated, a fatal mistake. In that heartbeat of uncertainty, the crowd's anger found its voice. Stones flew toward the altar. The sacred flames were kicked over. And the golden effigy of Intai, the very centerpiece of the festival, was torn from its pedestal, not in reverence but in rage. What followed wasn't just a riot. It was the unraveling of a cosmic lie. The priesthood had spent centuries convincing the people that disaster only struck when faith wavered. Now the people threw that logic back in their faces. If the emperor truly spoke for the gods, why had the gods forsaken them? The rebellion spread like blight through the empire, not with the organized marches of an army, but with the chaotic fury of 1,000 personal reckonings. Farmers seized temple storehouses, local governors were dragged into the streets, and the roads once trod by imperial messengers now teemed with refugees fleeing the collapse of order. The cruelest twist, the uprising didn't just topple a regime, it shattered a worldview. Intai Ramey had been designed to make the empire feel eternal, its rulers untouchable. But when the people saw their emperor fail to command even the weather, they realized something terrifying and liberating. If the gods weren't answering him, maybe they weren't answering anyone. The festival meant to bind the empire together became the wedge that split it apart. And by the time Spanish conquistadors arrived a few years later, they didn't encounter a unified Inca state, they found a fractured land, its people already disillusioned with the old gods and the men who claimed to speak for them. This is the paradox of state-sponsored spectacle. The more elaborate the ritual, the more devastating its failure. The Inca elite had bet everything on the idea that pageantry could substitute for results. The people, when pushed to the brink, chose survival over symbolism, and in doing so, they proved that even the sun god's favor can't fill an empty stomach or silence a people who have stopped believing. The towering ziggurat of Babylon shimmered under the spring sun, its glazed bricks reflecting the Euphrates like a second river in the sky. Below, the city held its breath. It was the 4th day of Akitu, the 12-day New Year festival where the king's very right to rule was ritually tested. For centuries, this ceremony had been the empire's heartbeat. The monarch would kneel before the statue of Marduk, grasp the god's hands in a symbolic bond, and emerge renewed, his power sanctified for another year. But in the year 539 before the Common Era, the hands of the gods stayed cold. King Nabonidus had always been an outsider, a scholar more comfortable with moon cults than Babylon's traditions. When he fumbled the sacred verses, when his grip on Marduk's statue slipped during the climactic ritual, the gasps in the temple weren't just shock, they were recognition. Because Akitu wasn't just pageantry, it was a cosmic job review, and in that moment the people, priests, merchants, even the palace guards saw the unthinkable, a king failing his divine performance evaluation. What happened next wasn't immediate violence, it was something far more corrosive: collective shrugs. Market stalls stayed closed an extra day, tax collectors found doors barred. The army, usually eager to crush dissent, moved sluggishly because if the gods had withdrawn their favor, who were they to intervene? Into this vacuum stepped Cyrus of Persia, a conqueror sharp enough to weaponize the festival's symbolism. His propagandists spread word that Marduk himself had chosen a new shepherd, framing invasion as divine transfer of power. By the time Nabonidus ordered the statues of Babylon's gods paraded through the streets, a desperate attempt to prove their loyalty, the people just laughed. You don't parade deities like prisoners unless you've already lost. The lesson here cuts deeper than one king's incompetence. Akitu revealed the double-edged sword of ritual legitimacy. For strong rulers, the festival was a coronation. For weak ones, it became a public firing, because when your authority depends on performing divinity flawlessly, a single misstep isn't just embarrassing, it's existential. Nabonidus didn't lose his throne to Persian spears alone. He lost it the moment his people watched him fumble in the temple and thought, if he's not chosen by the gods, then who is? And that's why this moment still matters. Modern leaders might not grasp divine statues, but they still perform ritual speeches, photo ops, carefully staged displays of competence. The underlying question remains, what happens when the performance cracks, when the script falters? Akitu teaches us that power sustained by ceremony can collapse just as fast. Because crowds that gather to applaud can, in a heartbeat, start asking the most dangerous question of all. Why are we clapping? The harbor of Carthage smelled of burning incense and spilled wine as the statue of Tannett, goddess of fertility and the moon, swayed above the crowd on her gilded litter. It was the third night of her festival, the moment when the city's elite would present their offerings: gold, jewels, the first fruits of the harvest, to prove their devotion. But this year, in the year 309 before the Common Era, the ritual took a sharp turn. As the high priest lifted the ceremonial knife to sacrifice a white lamb, a rotten pomegranate arced through the air and splattered against the statue's face. Silence gripped the square, then laughter, sharp, mocking, utterly sacrilegious. The ruling class froze because in Carthage, Tannett wasn't just a goddess. She was the divine mirror of the city's wealth and power. Her festivals a carefully staged display of who controlled prosperity. And now her golden face dripped with spoiled fruit while the crowd's jeers drowned out the hymns. What happened next wasn't spontaneous. It had been brewing for months. The aristocracy had squeezed the poor dry with taxes to fund their wars, then dared to flaunt their excess at the very festival meant to honor shared blessings. But the rebels didn't attack the priests or smash the altar. They did something far cleverer. They weaponized the ritual itself. Instead of lambs, they hurled dead rats onto the offering pyres. Instead of hymns, they chanted the names of children who'd starved that winter. The festival's sacred logic, that generosity to the gods brought prosperity, was turned inside out. If Tannett truly cared for her people, why were her priests so fat while the people withered? The genius of this revolt lay in its symbolism. By corrupting the sacrifices, the rebels didn't just protest inequality. They accused the elite of breaking the covenant with the divine. And when the city's mercenary guards moved to arrest the ringleaders, they hesitated, because in Carthage, even soldiers feared the goddess's wrath. That hesitation gave the rebellion time to spread. By dawn, the docks were in flames, not from foreign invaders, but from citizens burning the tax ships that carried their grain overseas. Here's what makes this moment so chilling. The Carthaginian elite had spent generations tying their rule to Tannett's favor. Now, that same connection became their noose. Because once the people decided the goddess was on their side, the aristocracy's power crumbled like dried clay. Within months, half the ruling council had been replaced by merchants and artisans, men who knew better than to mistake ritual for righteousness. The Tannett rebellion teaches us something brutal about the politics of spectacle. Rulers who drape themselves in divine pageantry had better deliver on its promises. Because when the gap between symbol and reality grows too wide, even the gods can become rebels, and no amount of gilded statues will save you when the people decide it's time to rewrite the sacred script. The thunderous echo of rubber balls striking stone courts usually meant celebration in the Maya world, but in the year 852, the sound signaled something far darker. The sacred ball game wasn't just entertainment. It was a cosmic drama played out by mortals, where victories and losses carried divine weight. When the ruling lords of Capon rigged a championship match in their favor, they didn't just cheat the opposing team. They insulted the gods. Imagine the scene, the grand plaza packed with spectators, the players' padded hips gleaming with sweat under the tropical sun. The underdog team, a group of rural farmers who'd trained for years, were poised to win until the referees, hands heavy with aristocratic bribes, began calling fouls that didn't exist. The crowd's murmurs grew into roars because this wasn't just unfair, it was sacrilege. In Maya belief, the ball game mirrored the gods' struggle to maintain cosmic order. Rigging the outcome wasn't just corruption, it was like tampering with the sunrise. The explosion of violence that followed wasn't chaotic, it was precise. Farmers who'd spent lifetimes hauling stone for royal temples now used those same stones to smash the nobles' viewing platforms. The elaborate feathered headdresses of the ruling class, symbols of their connection to the gods, were torn off and burned. And in a final act of defiance, the rebels didn't abandon the ball court, they reclaimed it. For days, they played their own matches, not for the entertainment of elites, but as acts of devotion, proving that the sacred game belonged to the people, not the puppeteers who tried to steal it. What makes this revolt so fascinating isn't just the fury it unleashed. It's what it revealed about the fragility of political theater. The Maya elite had spent centuries using the ball game to reinforce their authority, to show how closely they danced with divine will. But the moment they exposed the game as a rigged spectacle, they didn't just lose the match, they lost the narrative. Because when ritual becomes transparently transactional, it doesn't reinforce power. It exposes the strings holding it up. The aftermath echoed far beyond Capon. Neighboring city-states, hearing of the uprising, began scrutinizing their own rulers' manipulations of sacred traditions. The rebellion didn't topple the Maya civilization, but it did fracture the illusion of its rulers' invincibility. And that's the danger of turning faith into a spectator sport. The crowd might just decide to rewrite the rules. The bonfires of Samhain should have been a time of reverence, not rebellion. For centuries, the Celtic tribes had gathered on this sacred night, when the veil between worlds grew thin, to honor ancestors and welcome the dark half of the year. But in the autumn of 61 before the Common Era, the flames licking the sky carried more than prayers. They carried plans. The Roman occupiers had dismissed Samhain as primitive superstition, a harmless distraction. What they failed to grasp was how perfectly the festival's traditions served another purpose. The masks worn to ward off spirits, ideal for disguising rebel scouts. The practice of extinguishing all hearth fires and relighting them from a communal blaze, a perfect excuse to move freely between villages without suspicion. Even the festival's eerie atmosphere, the very reason Romans avoided it, became the rebels' greatest weapon. While the legions huddled behind their palisades, unnerved by the howls and drumbeats echoing through the fog, the Celts were doing something far more terrifying than communing with ghosts. They were organizing. The revolt erupted like a storm rolling in from the moors. On a signal hidden in the rhythm of ritual chants, warriors who'd spent the evening pretending to be spirits shed their disguises and became something far more lethal. Roman watchtowers, left undermanned by soldiers spooked by the night's strangeness, fell first. Supply depots went up in flames, their light blending with the festival bonfires until the entire horizon seemed ablaze. By dawn, 3 major garrisons had been overrun, not by an army, but by what looked like the land itself rising up in fury. What makes this rebellion so chilling isn't just its effectiveness. It's how completely the Celts weaponized Roman arrogance. The occupiers had assumed their superiority extended even to interpreting local customs. They never considered that the primitive rituals they mocked might be the perfect cover for military precision. Samhain's chaos wasn't chaos at all, it was a calculated smokescreen, a sacred occasion turned tactical advantage. The aftermath reshaped Roman policy for generations. Where they'd once tolerated native festivals as tools of pacification, they now saw potential traps, but the damage was done. The Samhain revolt proved something revolutionary. That tradition isn't just a link to the past. In the right hands, it can be a weapon for the future. The Celts hadn't just attacked Roman soldiers that night. They'd exposed the empire's blind spot, the fatal mistake of confusing sacred celebration with submission. And that lesson would echo far beyond the misty hills of Britannia, wherever conquerors assumed pageantry meant powerlessness. The roar of the crowd in Constantinople's hippodrome wasn't just excitement, it was a ticking time bomb. On the surface, the races were pure spectacle, chariots thundering around the track, rival factions of blues and greens screaming for their teams, the emperor presiding from his lavish box like a god among mortals. But in January of 532, the festival atmosphere shattered. A petty dispute over arrested fans spiraled into something far deadlier because the hippodrome wasn't just a stadium. It was the beating heart of Byzantine politics, where the people's voice could shake the throne itself. What started as cheers for charioteers twisted into chants for justice. The blues and greens, usually bitter rivals, did the unthinkable. They united. As the races ground to a halt, the factions turned their fury on Justinian, accusing him of corruption, heavy taxes, and ignoring the people's suffering. The emperor's guards moved in, but the crowd had already crossed a psychological threshold. This wasn't just a riot, it was a referendum. The hippodrome's very design, meant to showcase imperial power, now magnified the people's collective voice. 50,000 voices chanting Nika, victory, weren't just demanding change, they were rehearsing revolution. By nightfall, the city was in flames. Protesters barricaded streets with overturned chariots. The palace gates shuddered under waves of attackers. Justinian, trembling in the imperial box, nearly fled the city until his wife Theodora delivered the line that changed history: "Purple makes a fine shroud." Her meaning was clear: royalty should die before surrendering. With cold precision, the emperor turned the hippodrome's exits into death traps. His general Belisarius sealed the gates and flooded the arena with soldiers. 30,000 rebels died where they'd once cheered, the sand soaked in more than just horses' blood. The Nika riots exposed a brutal truth about festivals in authoritarian societies. Rulers who treat mass gatherings as safety valves often forget how quickly laughter can curdle into rage. Justinian had assumed the races would distract the people from their grievances. Instead, the hippodrome became the stage where those grievances exploded, and the aftermath even more revealing. The emperor didn't dismantle the chariot factions, he weaponized them, splitting their alliances and flooding their ranks with spies. The races continued, but now they were monitored like military operations, because Justinian understood what so many leaders learned too late. A crowd that comes together for games might stay to play for keeps. Here's what makes this moment so pivotal. The Nika rebellion wasn't just a historical footnote, it was a masterclass in the duality of public spectacle. The same space designed to entertain could also mobilize. The same traditions meant to unite could just as easily divide. And the same emperor who nearly lost his crown in the hippodrome would later rebuild Constantinople into a jewel, but never again underestimate the power of a festival crowd. Because when you gather people under the pretense of celebration, you're not just hosting an event, you're playing with fire. The drums of Toxcatl should have been a celebration of renewal, a sacred month when the Aztecs honored Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, with music, dances, and the careful selection of a flawless youth to embody the god before his ritual sacrifice. The air hummed with reverence as the chosen one, dressed in jewels and feathers, moved through the crowd blessing children, his every step a promise of divine favor. But in May of 1520, the festival's rhythm was shattered by the clang of Spanish steel. Cortés had left Tenochtitlan to quell a rival threat, leaving his lieutenant Alvarado in charge. The conquistadors had spent months studying Aztec customs, not out of respect but strategy. They knew Toxcatl was the one time weapons were forbidden, when warriors exchanged obsidian blades for flower garlands. So when Alvarado gave the order to blockade the great temple's exits, his men didn't just attack. They desecrated. Muskets ripped through rows of unarmed dancers. Blood slicked the temple steps where prayers had just been chanted. The Spaniards later claimed it was preemptive, that they'd uncovered an Aztec plot. But the timing was too precise, the violence too methodical. This wasn't self-defense. It was sacrilege as tactic. The massacre's true genius and horror lay in its symbolism. By striking during Toxcatl, the Spanish didn't just kill bodies, they murdered a worldview. The Aztecs believed their rituals maintained cosmic order. To disrupt one was to risk the sun itself not rising. As survivors stumbled through streets choked with smoke and screams, their terror wasn't just for the dead. It was the dawning realization that the gods hadn't intervened, that the sacred rules protecting festivals meant nothing to these foreigners. Moctezuma's downfall began that day, though it would take months to unfold. The emperor's authority had always been tied to his role as mediator between gods and men. Now, with Tezcatlipoca's festival drowned in blood, that bond cracked. When Cortés returned, he found a city no longer afraid of its rulers or their failed deities. The Spanish had gambled that violating Toxcatl would break the Aztec spirit. They were right, but here's what history often overlooks. The massacre didn't just weaken the Aztecs, it radicalized them. Later uprisings saw priests hurling sacred relics at conquistadors, warriors deliberately defiling Christian crosses during their own rituals. If the invaders could turn festivals into battlefields, so could they. Toxcatl became a lesson in asymmetrical warfare. When one side plays by rules and the other sees them as weaknesses, tradition becomes a trap. And empires that forget that don't just lose battles, they lose the stories that hold them together. The longhouse roared with laughter and the smell of roasting boar, its rafters draped with evergreen boughs that trembled as warriors pounded the tables in time with the scald's song. It was the height of Yule, the sacred winter feast when oaths were sworn, debts settled, and loyalty reforged for the year ahead. Jarl Eirik had promised his men land and silver for their service in the summer raids. But as the mead horns were passed around for the third time that night, the warriors noticed something strange. Their lord's own cupbearer kept skipping certain benches. The men who'd fought hardest, bled most, were given the weakest ale, while Eirik's kinsmen drank deep from vessels heavy with gold. In Viking culture, Yule wasn't just celebration. It was accounting. The feast's very structure, the seating order, the quality of drink served, even the cuts of meat distributed was a living ledger of honor and obligation. To slight a warrior's portion was to erase his deeds, and when one grizzled raider stood, his untouched cup in hand, and asked loudly why the men who'd taken 3 arrows shielding Eirik's retreat now drank like thralls, the hall didn't go quiet. It changed. The scald's harp faltered. The fire's crackle grew deafening because everyone knew what came next. The rebellion unfolded with the chilling precision of a ritual. No swords were drawn, not yet. Instead, the warriors began the nithsturng, the curse pole ceremony meant for oath-breakers. A horse's skull was mounted on a stake, its empty eye sockets turned toward the high seat. Ribs of driftwood, carved with the jarl's broken promises, rattled in the winter wind outside the hall. This wasn't mere insult. It was formal damnation, a public stripping of honor more lethal than any blade. Eirik screamed for his guards, but the men who'd sworn to protect him a year prior during last Yule now stood motionless. Their oaths had expired with the old sun. What happened next was written in runes on the longhouse door for generations. The warriors let the Jarl live, but only after forcing him to feast on the same thin gruel he'd given them, his fancy cloak traded for a beggar's furs. The message was clear. Yule wasn't just a time for making oaths, it was the moment they could be unmade. This revolt reveals something brutal about Viking power dynamics. Their festivals weren't escapes from reality, they were reality's starkest mirrors. A lord's strength wasn't measured in land or ships, but in his ability to stand before his men at Yule and have the feasting bench confirm what words could not, that he was worthy. The moment Eirik failed that test, his rule ended as surely as if he'd fallen in battle, because in the Viking world, winter wasn't just a season. It was the great auditor of men's souls, and Yule was when the books were opened. The floating lanterns on Tonley Sap should have been a vision of serenity, thousands of flickering lights bobbing on the water's surface, reflecting the full moon like scattered pearls. The Khmer Empire's annual water festival was meant to honor the river's life-giving power, a 3-day spectacle of boat races, feasts, and prayers to the gods of the flood. But in the year 1371, the river carried more than offerings. It carried rebellion. For months, King Barom Richia's tax collectors had squeezed the rice farmers dry, taking not just their surplus but the seed grain needed for next season. The people starved while the royal warehouses bulged. Yet when the festival began, the king's barges glided past the hungry crowds, their decks piled high with gilded statues and imported silks, a display so brazen it turned reverence into rage. The breaking point came during the ceremonial boat race when the royal team's vessel, manned by pampered nobles, miraculously won despite obvious cheating. As the officials raised the champion's banner, a single fisherman stood in his sinking canoe and hurled his trophy, a silver cup, straight at the judge's platform. What followed wasn't chaos, it was coordination. The festival's traditions became the rebels' blueprint. The floating markets, usually bustling with food stalls, now ferried weapons hidden under baskets of lotus flowers. The intricate canal system, designed for ceremonial processions, became a network for moving insurgents unseen. Even the lanterns played their part. Rebel lookouts used their flickering patterns to signal which bridges were unguarded. By midnight, half the city's guard posts were burning, their thatch roofs fed by the very torches that had lit the festival dances hours before. The king's fatal mistake was assuming pageantry equaled control. He'd thought the water festival's grandeur would distract from the suffering it was built upon. But the river had taught his people something he'd forgotten. Water might follow channels for a time, but when the pressure builds enough, it always finds a way to break free. The rebellion was crushed eventually, but not before the royal granaries were thrown open, not before the tax records sank into the mud of Tannett sap. And the next year, the boat races went on as always, but the king's barge stayed docked, its gilded prow pointed safely away from the people's eyes. This revolt reveals a truth that echoes across centuries. Festivals meant to showcase a ruler's generosity can become the very stage where his hypocrisy is exposed. The Khmer elite had turned the water's bounty into a private treasure. The people reminded them it belonged to everyone, because when you build your power on the backs of those who feed you, don't be surprised if one day they rise like a flood and wash you away. The bull-leaping arena at Knossos should have been a stage for royal propaganda. Lithe athletes vaulting over charging bulls, their grace and bravery reflecting the Minoan elite's divine favor. The crowds would gasp as performers somersaulted over razor-sharp horns, landing deftly on the blood-slicked stones behind the beast. It was the ultimate illusion, danger mastered, chaos contained, all for the glory of the palace. But in the year 1450, before the Common Era, the bulls weren't the only ones who refused to follow the script. For generations, the leapers had been more than athletes. They were living sacrifices, chosen from childhood for their agility and trained to dance with death. The palace promised them honor, but behind the painted columns, their reality was brutal. Whips kept them in line, failures were discarded, and the moment their reflexes slowed, they vanished from the frescoes like erased mistakes. The breaking point came when a young leaper named Chorus, mid-vault over a raging bull, spotted his crippled mentor being dragged from the arena by guards. The old man had missed his landing that morning, his spine shattered by a hoof. As Chorus twisted in the air, something in him twisted too. Instead of landing gracefully, he grabbed the bull's horns and pulled, steering the enraged animal straight toward the royal viewing box. What followed wasn't just an accident, it was an awakening. The other leapers, watching from the sidelines, realized their power. They controlled the spectacle. Without them, the bulls were just uncontrollable forces of nature. That afternoon, as the palace scrambled to contain the damage, the athletes made their move. They opened the gates of the bull pens during the next ceremony, unleashing chaos into the heart of Knossos. Frescoes that once showed perfect leaps now splintered under stampeding hooves. The rebels didn't just flee, they turned the sacred labyrinth itself against their oppressors, using their intimate knowledge of its passages to ambush guards and free slaves. The uprising's brilliance lay in its symbolism. Bull leaping had always been a metaphor for the Minoan elite's supposed mastery over nature's fury. Now the performers exposed the truth: their rulers weren't taming chaos. They were just one misstep away from being gored by it. Within weeks, half the palace's storerooms were plundered, its priests barricaded in the temple. By the time foreign ships arrived to quell the revolt, Knossos was already a hollow shell, its grand courtyards littered with shattered pottery and the bones of bulls left to rot in the sun. This revolt teaches us something profound about the fragility of staged power. The Minoan rulers had built their legitimacy on spectacle, on the illusion that they, and they alone, could orchestrate danger into order. But the moment the performers stopped playing their part, the entire fiction collapsed. because when your power depends on someone else's willingness to risk their neck, you'd better make sure they never realize they hold the horns. The streets of Nineveh should have been a river of gold and lapis lazuli as King Sennacherib processed toward the temple of Ashur for the Akitu festival. This was the sacred moment when the ruler would grasp the hand of the god, renewing his divine mandate for another year. But in the year 681 before the Common Era, the procession took a turn no chronicle had ever recorded. Halfway to the temple, a group of priests suddenly blocked the king's path, not with weapons but with parody. One clutched a ridiculous scepter made of gilded reeds that bent under its own weight. Another wore a crown of dried river mud that crumbled as he bowed mockingly. The message was unmistakable. This king was as fragile as his props. What made this sabotage so devastating wasn't just the insult, it was the timing. Akitu wasn't merely a religious event. It was the cosmic reset button for Assyrian power, where every ritual gesture carried the weight of prophecy. When the priests staged their humiliation, they weren't just mocking a man. They were rewriting the narrative of divine favor in real time. The crowd's reaction was immediate. Gasps turned to snickers, then to open laughter as the king's guards hesitated. Because in Assyria, laughter wasn't just noise, it was dissolution. A ruler whose grandeur could be laughed at was, by definition, no longer grand. Sennacherib's fate was sealed within hours. The priests had weaponized the festival's own symbolism against him. By corrupting the rituals meant to affirm his strength, they exposed the unthinkable, that the connection between gods and kings wasn't fixed. It was a performance, and the audience had just stopped believing. By nightfall, palace officials who'd groveled that morning were quietly shifting allegiance. The army, which had crushed rebellions without blinking, now moved sluggishly, because how do you enforce loyalty for a ruler whose divinity has been laughed offstage? This coup reveals a brutal truth about power's theatrical foundations. The Assyrian elite had spent centuries building an empire on spectacle, on towering ziggurats and lion hunts carved in stone. But the moment those spectacles were revealed as hollow, the empire's glue dissolved. Because when your authority depends on everyone agreeing not to peek behind the curtain, the first person to point at the ropes and pulleys isn't just a jester. They're a revolutionary. Sennacherib's successors would learn this lesson the hard way, adding ever more elaborate rituals to Akitu, but the damage was done. The priests had proven that in the right hands, a festival wasn't just a celebration of power. It could be its autopsy. The jungle clearing thrummed with anticipation as hundreds gathered for the unveiling of the Olmec's newest colossal head, a towering basalt likeness of their ruler, its features smoothed to perfection after months of backbreaking labor. The festival was meant to be the ultimate display of power, proof that the elite could command not just obedience but artistry from their subjects. Yet as the priests pulled away the final covering of woven mats, the crowd's gasp wasn't admiration. It was recognition. The face staring back at them belonged to the overseer who'd whipped workers to death hauling stones from the quarry. For the laborers who dragged that 20-ton monolith through swamps and up hills, the celebration was the last insult. Their blistered hands had carved those lips now curved in a smug smile. Their dead comrade's blood had watered the soil beneath the monument's pedestal. And as the ruler stepped forward to dedicate the head to the gods, a rock flew from the crowd, not at the statue, but at the workers' scaffolding holding it upright. The structure groaned, then collapsed. What followed wasn't chaos, it was calculation. The rebels had spent weeks sabotaging the head's base, replacing mortar with brittle clay. When it toppled, the damage was both physical and symbolic. The nose shattered first, then the lips that had barked orders. The festival's sacred aura evaporated as the crowd surged forward, not to flee, but to finish what the fall had started. Stone tools meant for carving ritual masks now chipped away at the head's remaining features, erasing the tyrant's likeness faster than it had been created. The Olmec elite's mistake was assuming ore could be manufactured through scale alone. They'd believed the sheer weight of their monuments would crush dissent underfoot. But the workers knew the truth. Every colossal head had a neck, and necks, no matter how thick, can always break. By the next harvest season, the quarry stood silent, the roads empty of dragged stones. The surviving rulers would commission no new heads, not because they lacked ambition, but because they'd finally understood. A statue's grandeur means nothing when the hands that built it are clenched into fists. The fire pits of Mohenjo-Daro glowed like 100 tiny suns scattered across the city's central plaza, their flames licking at the dusk as priests chanted hymns to Agni, the purifying force. It was the night of the Great Offering, when the Harappan people would burn symbols of their sins, straw effigies, withered crops, broken tools, to welcome the new cycle of seasons. But in the ruins of one particular fire altar, archaeologists found something unexpected. Not the charred remains of ritual offerings, but fragments of clay seals, the very tokens used by the city's elite to mark their ownership of grain stores and workshops. At first, scholars assumed it was accidental, a case of stray embers igniting nearby artifacts. Then they noticed the pattern. These weren't random seals. They belonged exclusively to the wealthiest merchants and officials, the same men who'd recently raised taxes while hoarding grain during a drought, and they hadn't just fallen into the flames. They'd been placed there deliberately, stacked like kindling beneath the ritual fires. What began as a ceremony of renewal had become something far more dangerous, a coded revolt. The brilliance of this rebellion lay in its ambiguity. Fire was sacred in Harappan culture, a force that could cleanse or consume depending on the will of the gods. By disguising their protest as piety, the dissidents left the elite with an impossible choice: crack down on the ritual and risk angering both the people and the deities. Do nothing and watch their authority literally go up in smoke. The surviving records are fragmentary, but the archaeological record speaks volumes. In the years after the mutiny, the clay seals changed. Gone are the intricate symbols of individual rulers. In their place, simpler marks appear: communal stamps used by worker collectives to approve shipments. This uprising reveals a subtle truth about the power of shared ritual. The Harappan elite had assumed their fire festival would reinforce the social order, reminding the people of their place in the cosmic cycle. Instead, the people used those same flames to rewrite that order. Because when you gather everyone around a fire, you don't just control the light, you create a space where shadows can conspire. And sometimes those shadows carry more than prayers, they carry the spark of revolution. The streets of Kyoto pulsed with the rhythmic clatter of wooden sandals and the sweet, sticky scent of candied fruit as the Jin festival reached its peak. Towering floats draped in silk and gold thread inched through narrow streets, their wheels creaking under the weight of generations of craftsmanship. For centuries, this celebration had been Kyoto's heartbeat, a sacred tradition where the city's merchant class displayed their wealth alongside samurai processions, a carefully choreographed balance of power. But in the summer of 1739, the delicate dance shattered. The merchant guilds had endured years of humiliation under the shogunate's oppressive policies. Samurai, forbidden by law from engaging in commerce, extorted protection fees from shopkeepers with impunity. The wealthy textile traders and sake brewers who funded the festival's lavish floats were treated as second-class citizens in their own city. Yet the festival's chaos offered something rare: anonymity. Behind the towering Yamaboko floats, beneath the din of flutes and drums, whispers of rebellion spread like spilled ink. On the third night, as the main procession wound past the shogun's officials, the unthinkable happened. The lead float, a masterpiece depicting a phoenix rising, suddenly lurched off course. Its massive wheels crushed the carefully arranged seating of the samurai elite. What seemed like an accident quickly revealed itself as sabotage when merchants began pelting the disrupted procession, not with the usual flower petals, but with copper coins, a brazen insult to the cash-strapped warriors who relied on their handouts. The shogunate's response was predictably brutal. Samurai drew swords on unarmed merchants, splintering festival lanterns with wild strikes, but the violence backfired spectacularly. The bloodstains on silk kimonos and shattered festival masks became potent symbols. For the first time, the city's economic engines, the men who controlled its rice, its cloth, its money, realized their collective power. The next year, half the floats stood empty, their guilds refusing to fund what they now called the Shogun's Parade. Markets slowed to a crawl as merchants quietly diverted goods to rival cities. This uprising didn't topple the shogunate overnight, but it exposed a fatal flaw in feudal Japan's hierarchy. The elites had assumed cultural pageantry would reinforce their dominance. Instead, the Jun festival became a mirror held up to their dependence on the very class they despised. Because when you build your power on the backs of those who weave your silks and brew your sake, don't be surprised if one day they use the threads of tradition to weave a noose. The grasslands stretched endlessly under the summer sun, alive with the thunder of hooves and the twang of bowstrings as the annual Nodam festival reached its peak. For generations, these games had been the glue holding the Mongol tribes together, wrestlers testing their strength, archers splitting distant targets, riders pushing their horses to impossible speeds. The winners didn't just earn glory, they secured their clan's place in the Khan's favor. But in the year 1294, the games revealed something far darker than competition. They exposed the rot at the heart of the empire. Khan Bayan had grown reckless with power, showering his own bloodline with prizes while snubbing the champions of rival clans. At first, the slights were subtle, a disputed archery score here, a wrestler's victory overturned there, but during the horse race, the mask slipped entirely. Bayan's nephew, a mediocre rider at best, crossed the finish line first despite witnesses swearing another man's steed had led the entire way. When the judges declared the result final, the crowd didn't erupt in cheers. They froze because in that moment the unspoken contract of Nodam shattered. If the games were rigged, what else had the Khan stolen from them? The rebellion began not with swords but with symbolism. The next morning, the wrestlers from 3 Western clans refused to step onto the mat. Instead, they staged their own match outside the festival grounds, inviting every excluded champion to join. It was a masterstroke. By hijacking the game's sacred format, they turned Bayan's corruption into a spectacle of its own. The archers followed suit, holding their contest in silence, their arrows piercing targets painted with the Khan's crest. Each act of defiance was perfectly calibrated, not a rejection of tradition, but a reclaiming of it. Bayan's downfall came swiftly. The very horsemanship that had built the Mongol Empire now carried messengers between rebel camps at terrifying speed. By the time the Khan realized his error, half his army had defected to the game's true champions. The lesson was as brutal as a winter on the steppes. Nodam wasn't just entertainment. It was the empire's pulse, and the moment a ruler tried to fake that rhythm, the people would tear out his heart and hand it to someone who still remembered how to play fair. The Phoenician harbor city of Tyre shimmered under the midsummer sun as priests prepared for the most sacred night of the year, the awakening of Melkart. For centuries, this ritual had followed the same hypnotic rhythm. the god-king's effigy, draped in purple linen, would be laid upon a bier and mourned for 3 days before priests revived him with sacred fire and chants. The crowd would erupt in joy, their faith in the cycle of death and renewal reaffirmed. But in the year 392 before the Common Era, the ritual symbols were stolen right from under the elite's noses. A rebel faction had spent months infiltrating the priesthood, their scribes subtly altering the sacred texts just enough to shift the meaning. When the high priest reached the climactic moment, raising his arms to summon Melkart's spirit, the rebels' plants in the crowd began shouting not the traditional hymn, but a twisted version. The king in his tomb, the people their god. The words slithered through the square like a spark through dry reeds, because everyone understood the subtext. If a god could rise from symbolic death, so could a people from oppression. What made this revolt so devastating was its theatrical precision. As the confused priests scrambled to maintain control, rebel actors disguised as temple acolytes began distributing small clay figurines, usually tokens of Melkart's resurrection, now crudely reshaped to resemble shackles breaking. The festival's central bonfire, meant to symbolize divine light, was fed with tax records and debt scrolls stolen from the palace archives. The smoke carried their message across the city, what the elite called sacred tradition, the rebels reframed as a blueprint for revolution. By dawn, the harbor swarmed with ships commandeered by dockworkers who'd spent years building vessels for trade, now repurposed as escape routes for freed slaves. The city's ruling council, still in their ceremonial robes, found themselves barricaded inside the very temple where they'd staged their power for generations. The brilliance of the rebellion lay in its irony. The elites had spent centuries using Melkart's resurrection to promise stability. The rebels proved that resurrection, by its very nature, means something must first die. And here's the chilling lesson Tyre's rulers learned too late. When you build your legitimacy around a festival of renewal, don't be surprised when the people take you at your word. The rituals meant to ensure your power can just as easily become its funeral pyre, because the true danger of symbolic acts isn't in their performance, it's in who gets to control the ending. The wind howled across the steppe, whipping the manes of 1,000 horses gathered for the Scythians' greatest festival, a week of races, feasts, and sacred rites honoring the bond between rider and mount. For generations, this gathering had been the nomadic empire's social glue, where tribes temporarily set aside rivalries to celebrate their shared identity. But in the shadow of the sacred totems, where chieftains and warriors drank fermented mare's milk from golden cups, darker currents flowed. The festival wasn't just a celebration. It was a tribunal. This particular year, tensions had been simmering like a pot left too long over the fire. A harsh winter had decimated herds, and the high chieftain's decision to seize the best grazing lands for his own tribe had left others starving. When the traditional grievance ceremony began, a ritual where any warrior could voice complaints before the assembly, the usual respectful murmurs gave way to open defiance. A young rider from the western clans threw not just words, but the rotting carcass of a stillborn foal at the chieftain's feet. "You feast while our horses die." The accusation hung in the air, thicker than the smoke from the ceremonial fires. What happened next rewrote the rules of Scythian politics. The high chieftain, instead of offering concessions, laughed and ordered the man whipped, a fatal miscalculation. Because the festival grounds weren't just any meeting place, they were neutral territory where even enemies rode under temporary truce. By violating that sanctity, the chieftain didn't just anger one clan. He shattered the illusion of fairness that held the nomadic confederation together. The revolt unfolded with the precision of a well-rehearsed dance. The horse races, usually displays of skill, became military drills as riders formed impromptu cavalry units. The archery contests turned deadly when arrows meant for straw targets found flesh instead. Most devastating of all, the rebels used the festival's own sacred rituals against their oppressors during the ceremonial sacrifice of a white stallion, traditionally a symbol of unity. They slit the throats of the chieftain's bodyguards and let their blood mingle with the animals in the offering bowl. The message was unmistakable. The gods had chosen new protectors. This uprising reveals something profound about nomadic power structures. Unlike settled empires that relied on walls and tax collectors, the Scythian strength came from voluntary loyalty, from tribes choosing to follow the strongest rider. The moment a leader proved unworthy, the festival's communal nature became his undoing. There were no palaces to retreat to, no granaries to control. Just endless grassland and a people who could vanish into it with their herds, leaving tyrants to rule empty steppes. By the next new moon, the high chieftain's skull adorned a rebel's saddle as a drinking cup, a grim Scythian tradition for fallen enemies. The tribes dispersed to their seasonal grazing lands, but the lesson galloped across the continent. A nomadic festival wasn't just a gathering. It was the one time of year when the people held all the cards, mounted on fast horses and armed with the knowledge that in a land without borders, loyalty was the only currency that mattered. And that currency could be spent as quickly as a well-aimed arrow. The scent of crushed marigolds and burning sandalwood should have been soothing as Emperor Ashoka prepared for the annual Vasantotsava Spring Festival, a centuries-old celebration where the Mauryan Empire welcomed new beginnings with flower battles, poetry contests, and the crowning of a symbolic spring king. But this year, in 262 before the Common Era, the air crackled with tension. Ashoka, freshly converted to Buddhism after his bloody Kalinga conquest, had decided to purify the festivities. Gone were the raucous fertility dances and wine-soaked revelry. In their place, monks in saffron robes chanted sutras while officials distributed Buddhist texts instead of the usual flower garlands. To Ashoka, this was enlightenment. To the people, it felt like erasure. The spring festival wasn't just entertainment, it was a living contract between rulers and the earth itself. Farmers who'd spent all winter praying for rain saw the dances as vital rituals, not vulgar displays. The Brahmin priests, stripped of their ceremonial roles, whispered that neglecting the old gods would bring famine. Even the empire's soldiers, loyal to Ashoka's military reforms, balked when told to decorate their swords with lotus motifs instead of the traditional tiger emblems of spring. The breaking point came during the flower battle, a chaotic free-for-all where nobles and commoners alike pelted each other with petals in a symbolic melting of social barriers. This year, Ashoka's guards intervened, scolding participants for frivolity and insisting they meditate instead. A young nobleman, his silk tunic stained with turmeric, threw his entire basket of blossoms at the nearest monk's feet. "If your dharma can't withstand joy," he shouted, "what good is it?" The square erupted not in meditation, but in the first riot the empire had seen in decades. Ashoka's reforms backfired spectacularly because he misunderstood the festival's true power. These weren't just parties. They were pressure valves, the rare moments when soldiers could mock officers, when low-caste laborers could share sweets with merchants, when the empire's rigid structure bent just enough to prevent snapping. By trying to sanitize the chaos, Ashoka didn't elevate spirituality, he exposed its limits. The aftermath unfolded quietly but fatally. Provincial governors reported declining tax revenues as farmers skipped the new festivals. Merchants redirected donations from monasteries back to local temples. Even Ashoka's famed rock edicts, carved with Buddhist teachings, began appearing defaced, not with anti-Buddhist slogans, but with the old spring festival symbols scratched over them. The emperor had sought to transform society through ritual. Instead, he learned the hard way that festivals don't just reflect culture, they sustain it. And when you try to redirect that sustenance, even with the best intentions, you risk starving the very people you meant to nourish. This revolt holds a mirror to modern debates about cultural preservation. Ashoka wasn't a tyrant. He genuinely believed Buddhism would bring peace. But good intentions can't erase the human need for belonging, for traditions that feel like home. The Spring Festival rebellion proved that even the most enlightened ruler can't mandate unity, because true harmony isn't imposed from above. It grows from the ground up, like wildflowers pushing through cracks in stone. And no decree, however wise, can ever dictate how they bloom. The drums of Purali thundered through the stone gates of Hattusa, their rhythm mimicking the storm god's heartbeat as priests in blue robes scattered barley and silver dust across the temple steps. This was no ordinary festival. It was the Hittite Empire's lifeline, a plea to the heavens for rain, fertility, and divine favor. The king stood resplendent in his horned crown, ready to reenact the sacred myth where the storm god defeats the serpent of drought. But in the year 1320 before the Common Era, the ritual's magic failed him. The skies stayed barren, the fields cracked like broken pottery, and a rival prince saw his chance. Prince Zida didn't need swords or armies to strike. He had something far more dangerous: symbolism. As the king raised his hands to summon the rains during the climactic ceremony, Zida stepped forward, not to kneel but to accuse. His voice cut through the incense-thick air. When the storm god speaks through drought, should we not ask whose sins choke the clouds? The gasp from the crowd wasn't just shock. It was recognition. In Hittite belief, failed rains weren't misfortune. They were divine indictment. By tying the king's ritual performance to real-world catastrophe, Zida didn't just challenge his rule. He framed rebellion as religious duty. What unfolded next was a masterclass in political theater. Zida's faction had spent months preparing. When the king's priests tried to drown out his words with chants, farmers in the crowd began shaking empty grain sacks. Children held up withered stalks of barley, living proof of the king's broken covenant with the gods. The festival's sacred props became weapons. The ceremonial serpent effigy, meant to symbolize defeated chaos, was torn apart by angry peasants, conveniently Zida's own men in disguise, its fragments trampled underfoot to show what happened to rulers who couldn't control the elements. The king's fatal mistake was assuming ritual authority equaled actual power. He'd spent years perfecting the choreography of Purali, the precise footwork, the exact pitch of invocations, but neglected the harder art of irrigation projects and grain storage. Zida, by contrast, arrived with sacks of emergency millet from his own well-watered estates, distributing them during the festival as proof of the storm god's favor. The message was irresistible. If a mere prince could bring bounty, why crown a king who brought only drought? This coup didn't end with a single battle. It unraveled the Hittite monarchy's sacred contract. Provincial governors, already strained by years of famine, began withholding troops, saying they couldn't risk offending the gods further. The army, whose loyalty depended on the king's divine legitimacy, fractured along regional lines. Within 5 years, the empire was a shadow of itself, not because of foreign invasion, but because Zida had exposed a terrifying truth. When your power depends on performing control over nature, and nature stops cooperating, even the most elaborate rituals become your indictment. The lesson here transcends ancient history. The Hittites' downfall reminds us that pageantry and real power must walk hand in hand. A leader can stage the grandest spectacles, but if the rains don't come, if the people hunger, if the land rebels, no amount of ceremonial splendor can glue a fractured kingdom back together. Because when the gap between performance and reality grows too wide, even the gods you claim to speak for might just side with the revolution. The Numidian plains stretched bare under the searing sun, their usual golden waves of grain reduced to brittle stalks that snapped underfoot like old bones. Every eye in Cirta's central square was fixed on the stone platform where King Gaia's tribute should have been piled high, the first fruits of the harvest, offered to the gods in gratitude for their bounty. But the baskets stood half empty, their meager contents mocking the crowd's hunger. The drought had lasted 3 years now, and while the royal granaries still held reserves, the king's offering this festival day was barely enough to feed a single family. A murmur rippled through the crowd, swelling like the dry wind that carried it, because in Numidian tradition, the grain festival wasn't just ceremony. It was a sacred ledger where rulers proved their worth by matching the people's sacrifices with their own. What happened next wasn't spontaneous fury, it was meticulous. The priests, who'd spent months watching their temple stores dwindle while the king's agents still collected taxes, let the ritual silence stretch too long after Gaia's meager invocation. That pause became a chasm. A woman from the drought-stricken western hills, her arms still dusty from the failed harvest, stepped forward and emptied her own satchel of shriveled barley onto the platform. The kernels bounced like hailstones against the stone. Then another villager added his handful, and another. Within minutes, the king's paltry offering was buried under a mountain of withered grain, each stalk a silent accusation. The brilliance of this revolt lay in its weaponization of sacred theater. By flooding the ritual with proof of shared suffering, the crowd transformed what should have been a display of royal piety into a damning audit. The priests, caught between loyalty to the throne and terror of the god's wrath, hesitated, and that hesitation was all the rebels needed. Artisans who'd crafted the festival's ceremonial baskets now used them to carry stones. Farmers who'd spent lifetimes harvesting grain swung their sickles at the god's spears. Even the children, usually given honey cakes during the festival, hurled them at the king's face like clods of dirt. Gaia's downfall came not from military defeat, but from the unraveling of a story. The Numidians had always believed their kings ruled by divine favor, their legitimacy measured in the same bushels that fed the people. When the king failed that test publicly, irrevocably, the spell broke. By nightfall, the granary doors had been splintered open, their contents spilling into the streets not as loot, but as redistribution, a living enactment of the justice the festival was supposed to celebrate. And the new ruler who emerged from the chaos, a drought-hardened farmer priest who made his first decree not from a throne, but from the offering platform. No one eats until everyone eats. This uprising reveals something primal about the relationship between power and ecology. The Numidian kings had built their legitimacy on the illusion of control, that their rituals could command rain, that their granaries could defy drought. But when nature itself refused to cooperate, the festival's symbolism inverted. The same baskets meant to showcase royal generosity became evidence of theft. The same prayers that once sanctified authority now underscored its failure, because in the end, no amount of pageantry can mask the most basic equation of governance. When the people starve while the palaces feast, even the most ancient traditions won't save you from the reckoning. And sometimes that reckoning wears a crown of dried barley and speaks with the voice of 1,000 empty stomachs. The streets of Pataliputra erupted in a riot of color, clouds of crimson and saffron powder swirling through the air, dyeing silk-clad merchants and barefoot laborers alike in the same vibrant hues. Holy had always been the Gupta Empire's great equalizer, the one day when caste lines blurred under a shared rainbow of celebration. But in the year 412, the festival's playfulness took on a sharper edge. The lower castes, tired of scrubbing Brahmin floors only to be barred from temple doors, had discovered something dangerous. The same dyes that amused the elite could become weapons of humiliation. What began as cheeky mischief, a washerman's son dousing a priest's white robes in eggplant purple, quickly spiraled into something far more subversive. The rebels didn't just stain clothing, they targeted symbols. A statue of Brahma was splattered with indigo until the god's four faces became indistinguishable. Sacred texts left unattended during the revelry were gifted rainbow margins by scribes' apprentices. Even the festival's traditional bonfire, meant to burn away winter's impurities, was fed with threadbare sacred cords torn from the rebels' own wrists. The message was as bold as the pigment staining the city. If caste could be temporarily erased by dye, perhaps it wasn't divine law after all. The Brahmin elite's reaction revealed their panic. They tried to ban colored powders near temples, then demanded lower castes use separate and washable pigments, but prohibitions only fueled the rebellion's creativity. Farmers began grinding drought-withered marigolds into dust, turning the failure of the Brahmin promised rains into a taunt. Dyers reserved their most vibrant hues, once reserved for aristocratic garments exclusively for sacred statues. The festival's chaos, once safely contained by tradition, now exposed the fragility of the social order. What makes the Holy Rebellion so revolutionary wasn't its violence, it was its weaponization of joy. The rebels didn't attack the system with swords, but with the very thing the elite couldn't suppress without revealing their hypocrisy: celebration. By hijacking the festival's symbolism, they proved hierarchy's greatest weakness. It relies on everyone agreeing to play their part. When the oppressed decide the game is rigged, even play becomes protest, and no amount of scrubbing can remove the stain of that realization. Festivals aren't just celebrations, they're pressure cookers for revolution. Think about it, where else do you get thousands of emotionally charged people gathered in one place, their everyday social rules temporarily suspended, all steeped in rituals that carry generations of meaning? That's not a party, that's a powder keg waiting for a spark. Take the suspended hierarchies first. During Rome's Saturnalia, masters served slaves. At the Dionysian festivals, women could roam freely at night. These temporary role reversals weren't just fun and games. They gave people a taste of what life could be like without rigid social structures. And once you've sampled freedom, even symbolically, it's human nature to want more. Rulers assumed these controlled inversions would reinforce the status quo by letting off steam, but history shows the opposite. They became rehearsals for rebellion. When the Celts used Samhain's masked traditions to hide rebel scouts, or when the Olmec laborers sabotaged their own colossal head monument, they proved that temporary anarchy can plant permanent ideas. Then there's the crowd factor. A festival gathers bodies, yes, but more importantly, it gathers attention. The very spectacle designed to showcase a ruler's power, like Pharaoh's golden barge procession or the Byzantine chariot races, became the perfect stage for public humiliation when things went wrong. In Nineveh, priests mocked their king during the Akitu festival with crumbling props. In Kyoto, merchant guilds weaponized their own parade floats against the shogunate. These weren't random riots, they were calculated performances where the audience suddenly became the actors, turning state-sponsored pageantry into improvised political theater. But the real game changer is symbolism. Festivals operate on mythic logic where every gesture carries amplified meaning. When the Numidian king offered meager grain during a drought festival, it wasn't just stinginess, it was sacrilege. When Persian rebels threw rotten fruit at Tannett's golden statue, they weren't just vandalizing art, they were accusing the elite of breaking divine law. Rituals are the stories cultures tell themselves to justify power structures. The moment those stories are hijacked, like when the Harappan workers burned tax seals in sacred fires, or when the Hittite prince framed a failed rain ritual as divine judgment, the entire foundation of authority starts cracking. Here's what terrified rulers from Babylon to the Khmer Empire: you can't control meaning forever. Festivals might start as tools of social control, but their very nature makes them vulnerable to reinterpretation. A dance meant to honor gods can become a protest against taxes. A bonfire meant to purify can ignite revolution, because at their core, these gatherings aren't about the rulers who sponsor them, they're about the people who bring them to life. And when those people decide to rewrite the script, no amount of soldiers or sacred texts can stop them. The most dangerous thing about festival rebellions isn't the chaos they unleash in the moment, it's the realization they leave behind. That power isn't fixed. It's performative, and performances, no matter how ancient, can always be cancelled. From Rome to the Indus Valley, one lesson echoes across the millennia. When rulers mistake festivals for distractions rather than dialogues, they seal their own fate. These weren't mere parties spiraling out of control. They were moments when the veil of power slipped, revealing a truth tyrants and emperors dreaded: that rituals meant to awe the people could just as easily awaken them. Take the broken grain baskets of Numidia or the blood-stained chariot tracks of Constantinople. In each case, the elite's carefully staged spectacles became the very tools of their undoing, proving that symbolism is a weapon that cuts both ways. What makes these rebellions so timeless isn't just their drama, it's their blueprint. Festivals gather crowds, yes, but they also forge collective identity. A farmer who'd never dare confront a tax collector alone might hurl rotten fruit when surrounded by 1,000 others painted in Holi's defiant colors. A scribe who'd tremble at the thought of insulting a pharaoh could chant treason during the Opet festival's chaos, his voice lost in the chorus. These celebrations didn't create dissent, they revealed it, giving shape to frustrations that had simmered silently for years. And here's the kicker: the rulers often funded their own downfall. The gold that gilded Tannett's statue in Carthage paid for the docks rebels later burned. The obsidian blades Aztec priests used to cut out hearts became weapons turned against them. Even the Roman Saturnalia's feasts, meant to placate the poor, fed the very energy that fueled their revolts. There's a brutal irony in that the resources spent to project invincibility often bankrolled the forces that shattered it. But perhaps the most chilling lesson lies in what happened after the fires died down. Victorious rebels from Babylon to the Khmer Empire rarely abandoned festivals altogether. They repurposed them. The same bonfires that once honored kings now celebrated their overthrow. The dances meant to appease gods became rites of liberation. This wasn't just practical, it was psychological. To rewrite a festival was to rewrite history itself, proving that the stories we tell about power aren't set in stone. They're etched in the temporary ink of tradition, always one collective act of defiance away from being redrawn. So the next time you see crowds gathering for a parade or a harvest celebration, look closer. Beneath the music and masks, there's always a whisper of possibility, the unspoken understanding that joy and justice aren't opposites. They're allies waiting for the right moment to dance. If these stories resonated with you, let's keep the conversation going. Drop a like if you're hungry for more deep dives into history's explosive turning points, and shout out in the comments which ancient revolt left you stunned. The chariot races of Byzantium, the lantern signals of Han China, your input shapes what we explore next. And as always, stay curious, because history isn't just about the past. It's a mirror, and sometimes the reflection it shows us is blazing with festive.